Tour of part of Glen Ree. Glen Ree is the valley that runs between Carlingford Lough and Lough Neagh. And you can see here we are at Poyntzpass, halfway along it. It's a notable valley because of its length really, and the fact that there's not that much change in height between here and here. Well, Lough Neagh is 52 feet above sea level. Poyntzpass is about 72 or 3 above sea level. So there's relatively little change along its length, and that was of strategic significance in the old days, simply because being a valley, it was completely flooded most of the time. It was an impassable barrier if you wanted to move west to east or vice versa. And there were only 3 places where the land, solid land, came close enough on either side of the valley to permit the possibility of all-year crossing. Those 3, Jarrett's Pass, Poyntzpass and Scarva. And you see 2 of those have pass in their names, indicating again their importance and significance. So in this tour we'll be doing just a little bit initially about the origins of Poyntzpass, and then we'll be moving on, let's say, to deal more about the valley, about the canal, and then about the Danes Cast, the ancient linear structure that's best seen in this part of the valley. Danes Cast runs from here to Newry, so it looked as though it had some military significance in old days. We'll discuss what that might have been. Okay, our first stop will be an Acton old graveyard, so if you could get your vehicles, I'll be over there starting in that Jeep. We'll go up the Market Hill Road, first right and first right, and I'll take you back to Acton old graveyard. These gentlemen, if you do not destroy your digestion, eat that, and if you go take immediate right there and the fork at the left past the spar shop, and you'll find us go up that road and you'll intercept us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, right, shall we proceed then?
That is the face in the wall.
And I want to introduce you to Barbara Best, who will talk a bit about the origins of Poyntzpass and how its name came about and where this old graveyard fits into that story. I know 1 or 2 of you have done the walking tour this morning. I'm sorry, just for this bit there's going to be some repetition. Apologies, but Barbara, please.
You're gluttons for punishment if you've done the walking tour this morning and this now. Well, this is only a few minutes. You're very welcome, and the noise you can hear, you probably know the tractor on, did you? I imagine that's what that is. And apologies for the state of me. Hugh just came on me round the road there with my head in a hedge trying to find my mains water turn off. I didn't find it, so. So, you're very welcome to Acton Old Graveyard. It is more or less circular, and as a general rule that denotes a very old holy place, either a burial ground or just a worshipping ground, but a holy ground of some sort. And probably much later, the church here, of which there's nothing remaining, was built in 1684, but we think it was probably a very, very old holy place before that. So as you can see, as you know from driving round, this is not Acton Grave. It's in Acton. It is Acton Graveyard, but there's no. It's not part of the church now. So whenever this was first a churchyard or graveyard, all the area around here was wooded. There was solid woods, and during the 1800s, 19th century, a lot of that timber was sold off. Mature trees of various kinds sold for, sorry, just check my notes. There were full-grown beech trees, 60 years old, which were felled. Also ash, suitable for rollers and beetling beams. So all of this, there was also larch, Scots spruce, oak, ash and sycamore, all sold off. So if you picture first of all the whole area being wooded, and all that's left, obviously we have the yews. Better let them go past. What do you think?
Tractor run.
That's the tractor run.
More coming.
So the yew trees, most of you will know that yew trees are connected with Christianity particularly, but also with pagan beliefs about the passage of the soul from the living world to the hereafter. And the other reason for having yew trees in churchyards is that they are very poisonous to cattle. So the presence of yew trees makes pretty sure that the farmers round about keep their cattle out of the graveyards and so don't desecrate the graves. So several reasons for keeping yew trees. In their season in here there are primroses, bluebells, snowdrops, daffodils and lots of other lovely things, some of them naturally here and some of them planted. So why was there a church here in the first place? Well, you will all have heard now of Sir Toby Poynts. Sir Charles Poynts, first of all, Toby's father, who was granted 500 acres in this townland.
I didn't
You've
go
done
through
this.
that for those about the origins of Poyntzpass.
Okay.
Poyntzpass is named after Charles Poynts because in the old days, the time of Elizabethan times, when England started introducing plantation and all that and colonised this part of Ireland, there was a garrison at Scarva, a garrison at Poyntzpass and a military garrison. In 1600 Charles Poynts came to run the garrison, so Poyntzpass is named after him. He came from a place called Acton, north of Bristol. Brought some of his tenants with him and called the place where he settled the tenants Acton. So we go through the hamlet of Acton now in a minute or two, and you'll see across the way, if that hedge wasn't there, you'll see Acton House. Barb will talk about it in a minute. But that's how Poyntzpass gets its name, and Toby Poynts was the son of Charles Poynts.
Thank you, Roy. I was going to leave out Acton House, but now I can't. So,
Well,
no. So Sir Charles Poynts on his 500 acres, and he had to build houses, as Roy says, for his English settlers, 24 English settlers. And it's almost certain that some of those early settlers would be buried here. There's a fair likelihood. The only name we can find that is in common between Sir Charles's Poynts's the muster roll of his men-at-arms and of the people who are buried here is Wilkinson. Charles Poynts had a man-at-arms called Wilkinson, and there is a Wilkinson grave here. Doesn't necessarily say it's the same one, but that's the only one that is a possible link between those earliest settlers and the graveyard. So he built his 24 cottages, which you'll see, well, you'll not see them, but you see Acton Village. It was Sir Charles's son, Toby, who built the first church here. It was a holy place, as I said. He obviously thought that it was a good spot for a church, and it was the time when the local landowner thought, I'll build a church there. So Toby had his church here built by 1684. That was the stone, the commemoration stone that was built into the church, and was one of the last little remnants of it, in fact, for a long time. Interestingly, in Sir Toby's will, he said that he wanted to be buried. He said, "My body I desire may be buried in the church built by me, at Acton in the vault of my dear wife Rose Poynts. So his wife was Rose, who was Rose Buckworth, was already dead and buried in the vault, and we think that you see just here there's a paling fence. There's a vault there which you can. Hugh went down into it a few weeks ago. We think that's possibly the vault where Sir Toby and his wife Rose and the other Poyntses maybe are buried. The church would have stood somewhere just to the right of that. It's hard to tell because obviously the trees and bushes and things have grown up around it and disturbed any. Normally you would see a bit of a level place, but you can't really see that. It's hard to know just exactly where the original church was. It wasn't very large though. The walls were, I'll come to it. I think it was about 15 or 20 feet long and only 11 feet high, so it wasn't very big. So Toby managed to get his church built and just before he died, and then got himself popped in the vault beside his wife Rose. So that was 1685. So Toby and his wife Rose had 3 children. They had one boy, Charles, called after his grandfather obviously, and he married Lucy Lucas from Monaghan, and they had a son called Lucas, but he died young. So that male line of the Poyntses faded out. So Toby and Rose had 2 girls then, a Sarah and a Christine or Christiane. They both married. Sarah married Archibald Stewart of Ballantoy, who also has very, very strong connections with this part of the world, because it was the Stewarts who first came to, it was the Stewart who built Acton House. So they had estates in Ballantoy and came here because they married into the Poyntses. So the Stewarts and the Poyntses intermarried. So Sarah was married to Archibald Stewart of Ballantoy, and Christine married another man whose name will be familiar to all of you, I'm sure, Roger Hall of Narrowwater. So the Poynts girls, one married a Stewart and one married a Hall of Narrowwater. So being the descendants now, because the male line has died out, those 2 girls, Sarah, women probably, Sarah and Christine, become the inheritors of Toby Poynts' estate. So all his 500 acres, and of course he'd added more to it by then. Then one of the, so Sarah and Christine became beneficiaries, and then Sarah's son, who was a Stewart, bought his aunt out for £2,000. So Reverend Archibald Stewart now owns the whole thing. You don't really need to know this, except that
Where's Ballantoy?
North Antrim, Ballantoy Harbour.
Right.
North coast.
Lovely wee harbour. Most of you know? No? Yeah.
Okay.
Time you were up there, Hugh.
Should.
Obviously not a Game of Thrones fan.
Was some of it filmed there, was it?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Why?
Because it used to be a nice quiet place.
Ah, and now people come to see it because of Game of Thrones.
Yes.
That is unfortunate.
It isn't it? Yeah.
Now we have a connection with Game of Thrones in Poyntzpass, bonus.
Yeah. So that's the Ballantoy connection, and those Stewarts then, having come here, built the first Acton House. You can't see either of them right now. Roy will show you where they are. Then what happened? So then there was a series of Stewarts, generation to generation to generation. And what makes it complicated is that there were at least 2 Alexander Thomas Stewarts. So half times you don't know which one is which. But it was one of the younger Alexander Thomas Stewart he inherited the whole lot as a minor. And he inherited a load of debt because his father or grandfather in Ballantoy had tried to start a colliery and was it a ferry? A quay. Yes, he tried to start a colliery. Does that ring any bells?
There's an open cast coal place near Ballycastle.
That's maybe it,
Yeah.
And he was obviously going to ship the coal out from the quay that he was going to make at Ballantoy. So those ventures pretty much bankrupted them. And so the younger Alexander Thomas Stewart came here probably with debt as well, and even when they'd sold all that. so while all those Alexander Thomas Stuarts were busy both begetting more Stuarts and bankrupting themselves, the church here was falling into disrepair. So 100 years or so after it was built, by 1784, it was pretty much a ruin, and plans were drawn up to rebuild the church on this site. And all the agreements were in place with the Ballymore. It was Ballymore Parish, Ballymore and Tandragee. This was part of Ballymore Parish, and that the church in Ballymore was bursting at the seams, so they were very glad to have the opportunity of a chapel of ease here to take some of the numbers. And at that time, am I right? Yes, the Archbishop in Armagh was Archbishop Robinson, so he would have been, of course, very much on for another church and a new build. But for some reason that didn't happen, and we really don't know why. There are copies of all the indemnities of the agreement. They were the Board of First Fruits was going to put up some money. Ballymore were going to put up some money. They were going to build a road from here to the glebe, which still exists. The road was never made, and then suddenly that all fell through, and they rebuilt the church. Instead of here, they built it in Poyntzpass. And most of you will know where the Church of Ireland is in Poyntzpass, as you go on the right, as you go out of Poyntzpass to Newry. And to the great confusement of most people, that church in Poyntzpass is still known as Acton Parish Church, even though it's not in Acton. Skipped all that bit. Turn the page over. So at around the same time, Alexander Thomas Stuart was also, so the man who built Acton House, also either leased or gave the land for the new church to be built in Poyntzpass. He also granted the lease for the chapel to be built in Poyntzpass, and there was something else he did. So he was lashing money out all round him, having built Acton House and all the rest. Consequently, when he died, he left practically nothing. And after his time, he had a very interesting arrangement. He was also very much involved with the United Irishmen, very firm supporter of the United Irishmen's cause, and went back and forward to London to defend some of them who were imprisoned. So he was spending more money than he had, really. And having almost run out of money, he mortgaged the Acton estate to a man in Newry whose name will come to me maybe, and the agreement was that, wait, let's see if I've got it here. No. The agreement was with the mortgage holder was that the man in Newry was going to pay Alexander Stuart a lump of money to tide him over, to get his debts paid and to keep him going, and then was going to pay him so much a quarter. But what happened was that so if he had defaulted on the payments, who was paying who? I've forgotten. If he defaulted on the payments, the whole lot would have reverted to Stuart, and the Newry man was himself running into difficulties and was on the point of defaulting on his payments when, lo and behold, Alexander Stuart died. So the whole lot then reverted to the mortgagor, who inherited the whole estate. But because he was already in financial difficulties, he couldn't hold on to it, and it was sold then to the Close estate. And the Close estate then owned the whole kit and caboodle for about the next 100 years. I think that's all I have to say.
Okay. Down into the valley, which looks perfectly acceptable and able to be transferred, crossed, and how on earth could that be a barrier? Well, what you're seeing there at the moment in that landscape is about 1,000 years of agriculture and at least 300 years of organised drainage. And what you're seeing today is far, far different from what it would have been right up to the time of plantation. Some of the English generals who came across at the time of plantation for settlement. On their way to Mount Norris, they talked about having to hack a path through the forest to get to Mount Norris, because all of this ground would have been densely covered in forest. Perhaps a bit there you see over there, and therefore would have been quite impenetrable. Secondly, that valley doesn't always look like that. If I show you a photograph taken in August 2008 in that valley down on the other side of Poyntzpass, and those of you who have been on the train going to Dublin and south of Portadown looked at the fact that you're on a causeway through a lake because of the floods. So when it rains heavily, that valley is flooded from Portadown to Newry. And then you begin to appreciate why these passes were so important. As I say, and that is with all the drainage, 300 years of drainage that I've talked about. When you consider that would have had rushes, willows, gorse, every other type of wet plant, sedges, everything. And probably you're talking not about pneumatic tires, you're talking about iron cartwheels at the later stages. Before that it was just foot. So it was truly an impenetrable barrier, except for these three passes. I want you to look, you see the little white house, or the house there with the white ends, the gable ends?
Yes.
Look straight up above it and you'll see a cereal field on the horizon and a big clump of trees. That is Lisnagade Fort, Rath, all the same things. Defences of embankments to protect a building, a corral, capable of housing whoever lived there and the animals that they protected as well. We will be going over there to Lisnavara Rath, which is right beside it. And when you get up there, you will begin to appreciate why those raths are there. When you look at the view, you can see how to cross here. You don't have a view going towards the east, but the view to the west is fantastic. So that's the other reason we're going there. It's the start of the Danes Cast, the northern end of the Danes Cast. And as I'll explain you, the word Danes, quite false, a total misnomer, nothing to do with Vikings, Danes or anything like that. Existed long before the Vikings came to Ireland. Final point before we leave here, see this house, farmyard down below there, a stack of bales, etc. vehicles. Drum and Argyll House. I suppose noted because Charles Davis Lucas was brought up there. And Charles Davis Lucas was the first recipient of the Victoria Cross. His act of valour perhaps wasn't the earliest that merited it, but when it came to get the things, he was standing first in line in the investiture. Charles Davis Lucas was a midshipman on a Royal Naval vessel. Over time of the Crimean War, of course, but he wasn't anywhere near the Crimea. He was in the Gulf of Bothnia, which is that inlet of sea between Sweden and Finland. And they were shelling a Russian naval emplacement on the shore. Of course, Russia owned Finland then. And if naval and Russian fort was firing back, so a shell landed on the deck of the ship. Everybody cleared except Charles Davis Lucas, who ran to it, lifted it up and dropped it over the side. The darn thing exploded before it hit the water, so he was a lucky man, but nobody was hurt. And for that act of bravery, he was the first man to actually receive the Victoria Cross. So that's where he was brought up. Okay, I think that's what we want to talk about here. That's Scarva.
Oh, that's Scarva there. That's Scarva, right. Okay.
We will skirt the edges of it. Our next stop is at Reddicarn Cemetery. So we go down to the hollow here, take the road to the right, out onto the Poyntzpass Portadown Road and turn left and go out towards Tandregee and stop at Reddicarn Cemetery.
Give us a wave. Fantastic.
As you can see, there are two cemeteries here. This one's called Reddicarn, and that one over there is called Balnabeck. They're really old graveyards, far older than any of the gravestones would indicate. And there's some old gravestones in this one. But Balnabeck notable because in 1725, when they were digging out a grave, they found a bell. Used to be in old times, a bell followed the coffin and before the mourners, and the bell was rung on the procession way to the burial point. That bell was called the Bell of Balnabeck. It's now in the National Museum in Ireland, and it's dated to 1000 AD because there's an inscription on it saying, I think it's in memory of Allil. Allil was an assistant to Bishop of Armagh, and the records can date him accurately as to when he lived. I think he died in 1008 AD, so the bell is of that vintage. I haven't seen it, but someday I must go to the National Museum in Dublin to look at it. The other point, second point of interest in this graveyard, the remains of Redmond O'Hanlon was buried here. And how many of you know about Redmond O'Hanlon or have heard the name? Redmond O'Hanlon was either a rogue or a Robin Hood character, or both. He lived in this territory in the second half of the 1600s. This side of the valley, you're in O'Hanlon territory at the time of the plantation. On the other side of the valley, County Down side, you're in McGuinness territory. McGuinness territory, one of them ended up being knighted, and Guinness comes from that branch, that side of the valley rather than this side. But here you were in O'Hanlon territory, and the time plantation, the chieftain was Ogie Og O'Hanlon, the headquarters in Tandregee. But initially, Ogie Og supported the English forces. And so he retained his lands after the 9 Years' War at the end of the 1500s. But regrettably, he was married to a sister of Sir Cahir O'Doherty, who ruled part of Inishowen, Donegal, part of Derry. Sir Cahir O'Doherty again sort of supported Crown forces, but after the flight of the Earls, he was falsely accused of plotting against the English. And he was summoned to Dublin thinking like he could explain himself and all that and get away with it. Because of a coincidence of events, he actually got fined £1,000 or guineas at the time and told, be good hereafter. And then he came back to Derry, and he was insulted on the streets of Derry by the governor of Derry at the time, who seemed to be a very unpleasant man. At the end of all these insults, Sir Cahir O'Doherty in 1608 took an uprising, led an uprising against the English. Ogie Og here thought, well, ties of marriage are the most important thing, so he had to join, or his son certainly joined the rebellion and started the fight against the English. Of course, the rebellion was defeated. The O'Hanlons lost some of their lands, and they lost the rest of them then after the 1641 rebellion. Redmond O'Hanlon would have been one of the relatives, younger relatives of Ogie Og, and he seems to have been educated in England and France for a while, but he came back here about 1660 and became what's called really a Tory or a brigand or Robin Hood. Anyway, he exacted taxes from merchants, gave them pieces of paper which said that you can travel through the countryside in your business, and if any robber stops you, show them that. And if the robber continues to rob him, I'll kill the robber. So anyway, he had this sort of reputation. He was a pretty charismatic person. And one story is he was born in Poyntzpass, but it's more likely he was born somewhere around the foothills of Slievegullin. But between here, this territory, right out across as far as probably Rathfriel and Hilltown and further, he sort of ruled. He became such a menace to the government that the Lord Deputy of Ireland and Ormond started to offer the ransom for his capture and all that. And eventually he got a William Lucas, probably an ancestor of Charles Davis Lucas. William Lucas, who at the time resided in Drummondtown House, where the college is now. He took up the Lord Deputy's offer and said that he would ensure that Redmond O'Hanlon was killed or captured. Of course, so he sought out someone who could actually execute the deed, and he fell in with Art O'Hanlon. In fact, it's said that the man who introduced him to Art O'Hanlon was Sir Toby Poynts. Or you heard about it the last stop. Anyway, Art O'Hanlon was granted immunity if he killed Redmond O'Hanlon. And he did eventually shoot Redmond O'Hanlon at some place close to Hilltown in 1681, I think it was. Redmond O'Hanlon's head was cut off at that time, and somebody stole it to make sure it wasn't put up on a spike in Dublin or elsewhere. But somehow or other, by coercion or what, the man who stole the head was brought it back to the authorities, and the head was placed on a pole in Downpatrick for a while. But the remains of Redmond O'Hanlon ended up in here. Were buried in here, and then his Londonderry relatives, about some years later, came, exhumed the remains and took him. And you'll now find the gravestone and all in a chapel in Letterkenny, or Letterkenny in County Donegal. I think it's pretty ornate gravestone laid on the ground somewhere there. But if you want to find out the full story of Redmond O'Hanlon, which is a story of Machiavellian treachery in all its forms, you'll find it in Wikipedia, and it's well worth a read. The dirty deals all around. It was linked into the time, of course, the penal laws against the Catholic religion, linked into as well to the death of the Blessed Oliver Plunkett, who was Archbishop of Armagh, because Redmond was asked to testify against Archbishop Plunkett, and to his credit he refused to do so. But anyway, it is worth a read, that. There's another gravestone in there, down there, which we'll maybe walk to, but it's worth a look at, because it's of a man who was born in 1656 at the time of Redmond O'Hanlon, and he died 100 years later, which is remarkable for that era. Philip Loughlin died in 1756, age of 100 years. At a time when lifespan would have been, what, 40, 50 years? So, more power to him. One hopes he kept passing on his genes. The Canal took advantage, and say, obviously that valley all the way between Carlingford Lough and Lough Neagh. It was built in 1730s, it was dug out, and opened about 1742. Ostensibly, the economic reason for doing so was to be able to take coal from the coal fields at Coal Island through to the sea so that it could be shipped to Newry or to Dublin to supply Dublin with coal. This was the time before the coal fields in England had fully developed, and certainly before steam power really allowed the drainage of all the deep mines and allowed them to do coal be mined much more efficiently and brought across from England to Ireland. So this is the first what's called a summit canal. It was built in the British Isles. In other words, it goes up over the top and down the other side. Between here and Poyntzpass is the summit level of the canal. You see the water here going that way. If you go to Poyntzpass one, the water's going that way. But this is the same level from here to Poyntzpass. Two locks between there and where it joins the River Bann at the junction of the Kershaw River and the River Bann. 12 locks from Poyntzpass to the canal basin in Newry. I assume that when the canal was first built, it's sort of the ships come right up into the basin in Newry, probably without the need for a canal, but then later that canal section that runs down the side of the Omeath Road and joins Carlingford Lough halfway down the Omeath Road, that would have been opened as the ships got bigger and needed a greater draft. The other thing to notice here, how close the land comes together. Scarve is called the pass, but more than likely this was the place where the pass was, because you could just almost step across whatever river or water level there was. The canal here ran until the Second World War. It closed down just after the Second World War. I'll say in Poyntzpass you will see the anchor beside the canal, the anchor of the Nora, the last lighter to go up and down the canal. One of its great difficulties was getting enough water to come in at the summit level to keep feeding the locks. It was a terrible problem that limited really the effectiveness of the canal. Had we gone along that Poyntzpass Clondergee Road, another 2 or 300 yards, you could have looked right and seen a bridge sitting out in the middle of the fields. A stone bridge, multi-arch stone bridge sitting in the middle of the fields. It's an aqueduct. It was built to take water from the Kershaw River that runs through Clondergee and bring it to this summit level here. And later on we'll see we were actually passing over another channel which brought water from Lochbrickland Lake to feed into Loch Shark, Acton Lake, to feed the summit of the canal. And Acton Lake also, at the time the canal was built, Acton Lake was raised, dammed and raised, so it was higher than the level in there and could be used as a reservoir of water to supply the canal. The canal was important because there was a harbour built at Scarva and there was a harbour built at Poyntzpass. Where the New Baptist Church sits now in Poyntzpass, there was a 3-story set of warehouses there. And if you see photographs of the canal when it was working, it has quite a big basin there for the barges to moor, unload all their material. I would say that it was the canal that started off the prosperity of Poyntzpass and enabled it to grow, whereas you can see Acton effectively compared with Pass is withered. The advert looking for labourers to dig out the canal in 1733 tells them to go to Acton to sign up, not Poyntzpass, because I would reckon Poyntzpass then was nothing more than a few houses, probably close to where, as I say, the garrison was placed. But with the advent of the canal, you'll find that John Riley, who lived in Scarva House in the 1760s, I think it was, asked for a license from the government of Ireland to hold a market fair once a month. A market once a month. So, and then Alexander Thomas Stewart of Acton House, he did the same for Poyntzpass in 1790. And was once that license to hold a market once a month was held, that the prosperity of these places began to rise. Now, Poyntzpass has developed much more over the years than Scarborough. Why? I'm not sure. One reason I can think of, on this side, Scarborough, if you try to draw a horse and cart up the hill from Auckleash Cottages up, it's an awful steep climb. Whereas Poyntzpass, that Market Hill Road out to the west, is a much more gentle incline, so you can take a bigger load on your cart. And that might, the simple reason is that. Of course then, a century later, the railway arrived, 1840s. And the railway again really helped Poyntzpass. There was a siding built at Poyntzpass so you could park wagons there off the main track. And there's no siding at Scarborough at all. So that would have been a further boost to Poyntzpass. The bread used to come out of Belfast every morning for all the area out round here. Ran the wagon into the siding, and say there could be unloaded for distribution. And there was a collection point for milk there that took again the milk to Belfast from the area. Not only that, on a market day, Poyntzpass is a substantial market for cattle and livestock and everything once a month. And you could buy a bullock in Poyntzpass Street at this time of day, and it was in Liverpool the next morning, because it got on the train and the siding, loaded onto the train and the siding, took the train to Greenower, got the boat out of Greenower to Liverpool. So there were the communications there that really helped Poyntzpass, and that's, I think, why it is possible to say more than you see in Scarborough. Or again, Gerrard's Pass is probably the least of the three of those passes nowadays. Finally, just when we're talking about those passes, Poyntzpass, Gerrard's Pass, lock keepers. A 1770s map, 30 years after that canal was opened, lists the locks by the name, the surname of the lock keeper. Not by a number or anything, by the surname of the lock keeper. I find that pretty darn good, that a surname gets into the established nomenclature, if you put it, so quickly as that. And ever since then, every lock essentially is known by the lock keeper's surname. The one in Poyntzpass was Moody's lock, Moody being the last lock keeper. I'll say, what was McVeigh's was the next one?
Yeah.
Hanlon's. Hanlon's. So, you know, we're now, what's that, 70 years after the close? Still know the name. I think that's it. Oh, I pumped the names, yes. Poyntzpass, you heard, was Charles Point, named after. Gerrard's Pass is an interesting one. Gerrard's Pass was, at one time, first one was called Lamb's Pass, alright? And then it was called Tuscan's Pass, because Tuscan was the leader of a troop of cavalry that came to, I think, defend it at the time of the 1798 rebellion. And then it became Gerrard Pass, and that's been adulterated to Gerrard's Pass. But Gerrard was not a military man. Gerrard was a postmaster at the time of the end of the 1800s. And obviously it became so well established, so popular, that the name of the place developed his surname, and that has stuck since then. So it's unusual. There was another Ferreter's Pass, and it's unclear from the maps just exactly whether it was original name of Poyntzpass or whether it was some piece of ground in between Gerrard's Pass or Poyntzpass. But that's where the names come. Okay, we move on now. That way, turn right, go to Scarva, take the Bond Bridge Road out of Scarva, that's going left, and we're going to head up there, turn right and go to Lisnavara Fort. We'll be parking in a field there at Lisnavara Fort because it's a narrow road. The gentleman who lives beside it says, look, use my field, it's often used, it's perfectly safe for cars and all that. There's no difficulty getting in or out. I have to take him at his word, but I have a tow rope in that jeep of course.
To translate that, because that just means sport of whatever bar it translates as. Maybe it's
Partly from Poyntzpass, because there was a scene that was briefly set.
clean. Yeah. They're never as clean as Hatton Island McGee.
It reminds me of an Avonport.
They're all the same. This is a well preserved one.
Have the archaeologists got near it yet?
I haven't seen any word of them seeing it in this one. I haven't seen them here. That one over there. Here we are in Lisnavara Fort. An excellent example of a fort, and you can see a structure clearly. A central enclosure surrounded by ditches. This is a bi-valley fort. There are two ditches around it. Across over there you have Lisnagade Fort, which is three ditches round it, quite deep ditches, and over there it was found that the bottoms of the ditches were cobbled. So there could have been a walkway on the bottom of the ditches. Normally, as you can see from this one, the water accumulates and gets muddy and such like in it, and that might have been the case whenever it was active as an aid, as say, to defence. But you're here because when we walk over to that far side there and look over, you can see the start of the Danes Cast. It ran from the valley below here to Newry and was there. Well, why was it there? We can discuss that, but there doesn't seem to be a totally clear answer for it. But it will give you an idea that the Danes Cast must have been linked to these two forts here. When you stood in the top of that field and looked out west, you can see the commanding view you have from here. And if the cast was there as the defensive feature in the valley, this was the place to find out where it was. Now this whole area 1,000, 2,000 years ago would have been well populated. You're at the moment in the Church of Ireland parish of Acton. Someone has counted and said there's 96 forts in the parish of Acton alone. And on the county down, certainly all the way down that valley, there are lots and lots of these forts, wrasse, call them what you like. Many of them now, of course, have been obliterated, wiped out. But go back 200 years and look at the first Ordnance Survey map and just see how many of them. So, and it's said that the defensive feature of the Danes' Cast, it wasn't manned like the Great Wall of China with forts or Hadrian's Wall with forts. It's been argued that it was manned by a signalling system from all the wrasse on the high ground which all the wrasse were placed, so that you could signal one to the other, whether by semaphore or something in daylight or fires at night time. But it was supposed to be that that was the way you could pull people to the actual Danes' Cast to do defensive duties. If you walk around, please, and let's see if we can see it. We may have to go out onto that next bank to actually see it. I hope you're all capable of climbing up that slope, because I doubt if you're going to go down into these ditches and up the other side. What I'm looking for is down there, but I can't. I think we're going to have to make this reverse.
What? Oh, yeah.
Yes, if you can make it that all way, you think it is actually sounder putting a more secure than you would think.
This could be more fun than the talk.
Oh, don't film this.
Falling down.
Ooh, worth a couple of £100.
Maybe that's too small as well.
I think he's happy on terrain like this. I think he's not a fan of kind of footpaths and streets.
Anyway, notice the depth of that ditch. This clearly was an important place, well defended. When you see the depth of that ditch, it wasn't just a tuppenny halfpenny wrasse protecting one just particular family. It was protecting much more than that. And what we're looking for, you see the group of 4 or 5 cattle lying at the bottom of the field. To the left of that, you'll see a double hedge of trees. That's the start of the Danes' Cast. It runs from there, say, on and off all the way to Newry. Now, you'd wonder why, if this here, these 2 forts were controlling it, Lisnagate and Lisnavara, why did it stop down there? Well, the gentleman living in that bungalow tells me that that valley floods a lot of the time. So it's like Glen Ree. Obviously in older days it would again have been bogland and therefore difficult to cross. So that's maybe why it ended. But again, one of the questions posed by the Danes' Cast is, why did it turn away from the valley and come up here? Our next stop from now will be at the top end of that row of trees, and we look at the Danes' Cast there. But please have a look around here and take a walk out into that cereal field and take a look at the view, because Lisnad Lade beside us has 3 ditches. Tri-Valiant. Tri-Valiant was always associated with a chieftain or king, a leader of quite a territory. No one has ever conclusively stated who it was that constructed Lismagade and lived there and defended it. So there's that mystery about it, but it's definitely of the same level of complexity as the headquarters of the O'Neill clan, which you'll find on the road between Stewartstown and Cookstown. And it has the same sort of scale of view as that headquarters of the O'Neills. So it must have been someone of that level of importance. Whether it was McGuinness's or what, I don't know, because again, we're in McGuinness territory at the time of plantation. Okay, can you find your way back and over there? Take a minute or two. Oh, the gentleman in the bungalow here tells me if anybody needs a comfort stop, they may use his facilities.
Very generous.
For those hills there, where are we looking when we look down at those distant hills?
Do you remember when we went up the Market Hill Road, turned right and met all those tractors and turned right again?
Yeah.
You see the on-water tower?
Yes.
If you'd gone another 100 yards up that road, the on-water tower would have been on your
Right.
right
okay.
beside. Cold. See, you get down in.
Catch it?
Just hold on.
Yeah.
Hold your ball.
I think you have to go in there, yes. Come on.
Oh no. no.
3, 2, 1.
No, here, here.
3, 2, 1.
You go first. Gentlemen.
Over to the other side.
Who's next? I'll take a seat here if you go. Soft landing.
Yeah.
You're ready, you don't let go.
Well done.
I think it's a one-way ticket.
I think so.
Anybody
At
else?
least
Well, nobody's done that yet.
The northern end of the Danes Cast. We walk down this section here, down into the valley, and you'll have a look. Single ditch with a bank either side. And that really is the gist of its shape all the way, where remnants of it still last. The best preserved sections are between here and Poyntzpass, and they're all of the same feature. You see the trees grow up on both banks, and sometimes trees growing in the ditch as well. It runs from here down towards the back gate of Scarva House, runs through Scarva Domain, within about 100 yards of Scarva House itself, maybe even 50 yards of it on the Scarva side of Scarva House, down into the valley, turns left and then heads towards Loch Shark. Stops when it gets there, and we'll see a further section from the starts at the other end. We'll see a further section of it as we go back into Poyntzpass. So the Danes Cast is just but one of a number of these types of features found across Ireland, and some are more elaborate than this one. You see that picture there, or drawing on the front of this book, which is about another one of these linear entrenchments. This one is called the Black Pig's Dyke. The Black Pig's Dyke is simply a generic name, a legendary name about the great big black pig that ran its snout along the ground and dug it out. You'll find that sort of legend in Ireland in several places, and you'll find it in England, and for ditches found in England as well. So there's no specific name, like, you know, I talked about the canal there and the way every lock had the lockkeeper's surname, you know, which has persisted. There's none of that for any of these ditches. They are all like acquired, well, I'm going to say legendary names, but generic names. Now, why is this one called the Danes Cast? It has nothing to do with Vikings, so that we know, because it was there much earlier, and Vikings weren't inclined to build anything like that or dig out anything like that. I don't know where Dane comes from. You said that Lochgilly's called the alternative.
The actual lake at Lochgilly is also marked as Danes Loch on some old maps.
Danes Loch, yes.
Danes Loch.
Lochgilly is way over there on the far side of the Newry Armagh Road. Now, this little diagram here gives you some idea of the different lengths of some of these linear ditches found across Ireland. And the second one from the right there, second longest, is the Danes Cast. Probably you'll have to come close to see this, but the little red spots on this map, which is really of the northern half of the Midlands of Ireland, show you where some of these ditches have been found. That's us away over on the right hand side there above Carlingford Loch. As you can see, they're scattered around in short lengths. A century or so ago, some of the people looking at these thought, well, really, you could amalgamate all these and call it a defensive ditch for the Kingdom of Ulster. Now, up until about 300 AD, the Battle of the Three Colos, which is supposed to be 332 or 33 AD, the Kingdom of Ulster was a 9-county kingdom, if you put it that way. It was pretty much the province of Ulster as we would know it now. But in 333 AD, the Battle of the Three Colos, where the Midlands and Connaught ganged up against Fergus Foga, the King of Ulster, and fought him at Farney, just in North Monaghan. Fergus lost, and essentially he lost everything west of this valley and west of the River Bann. So Tyrone, Armagh and Derry were lost to the Kingdom of Ulster, and you were left really what was east, Antrim and down. So is this here a defensive ditch built, as I say, to protect that part of it? You would think, like, for the Kingdom of Ulster, the 9 county, it wasn't necessary. You had Carlingford Loch over there, which would have stopped everything, and you didn't have any defence really running sort of essentially north of what parts of the Black Pig Dyke. But that really is disproved, because the only excavations that have been done in this have been done on the Black Pig Dyke south of Clonus. An excavation was done there at a place called Ardkira. And the conclusion from the carbon dating in it was that it was started about 1500 years BC and continued, was built upon and survived functionally till just about 0 AD, maybe 50 AD, something like that. So it had passed its sell-by date really before the Battle of the Three Colos. There's been no excavations done on the Danes Cast, so we can't say when it was constructed. I looked up what it said about Listed Late Forth, and they suggested it only started about 300 AD. Again, if it's linked defensively to this, you would say then this is going to be built about in the 300 AD era. There is an aspiration in the Poyntzpass History Society to try and get an excavation done, but before we actually do that or organise it, and it's going to cost you £20,000 or so, maybe more, so that and whereas you can get funding, it would never fund more than half of it. So you really have to be certain of where you want to dig, first of all. So where do we dig? This is the hard part. Where do you dig on these sort of things to expect to find something? I noticed from literature, a book that was written in the early 1800s, there's stories of many arrowheads, spearheads, items linked to military found in it, but I'm not exactly sure where they were found and where have they gone to, because I don't know of them existing anywhere. So it probably was defensive, but you do think once the Iron Age came in and swords and iron swords and all that developed, that really they were obsolete. They couldn't effectively be defended. But if they were built as early as, dug out as early as 1500 BC, or that sort of time, they were dug with maybe wooden tools or at the most bronze tools, which was a colossal job. And I would have said it was a wintertime job, because I've been tackling, as the odd hole every now this summer. I've given up because it's that hard through this summer. You simply wouldn't be trying to dig it out. It's only in the wintertime when the ground's wet and soaked that it's much more easily dug out. Again, people estimate that one man can dig 1.5 meters of soil out in a day, cubic metre and a half. And when you add up what was taken out of these, you're talking about maybe 3, 4, 6, 7, 8 years in time working every day type of thing. So you're talking a decade or more and part-time for 500 people. Well, where did you get 500 people, say 2,000 years ago? I don't think there was the population around. Clearly, looking at Lisnavara Fourth and all the rats, clearly there was the talent was there. They knew how to do it. Digging ditches was something that had been developed early on and practiced in Ireland extensively. But still an incredible amount of work. And part of the reason perhaps that this is sort of patchy and broken up in places, at that time there wouldn't have been the central organisation we have of a government controlling the whole country. It was broken down into essentially the predecessors of town lands. Town land and the people living in town land areas were based on manpower. The area needed to sustain a certain manpower for delivery to the chieftain. So it may be that the work in constructing this was devolved right down to each town land. That you had to dig out your town land, and the next man had to dig out, or next chieftain or local baron had to dig out his town land. And maybe that some would be faster and more efficient than others. Maybe that's why it's so fragmented. I have no answers. I can't give you honest answers here. So let's just go and have a look. As I say, it's just a pity a lot of it is so overgrown now. And one of the best sections is near Poyntzpass. But there's a whopping big blackthorn hedge protecting it. And I don't think you're up to pushing through a blackthorn hedge. So let's go and take a walk. Assume that the banks were higher when it was built, and proportionately the ditch was deeper. It was back, you can see the depth there in Lisnavara Fourth. It must have looked somewhat like that. Why the width though? It really is wide, isn't it? And it's like that all the way, certainly from here to Poyntzpass. So if you got, yes, before the Iron Age and the manufacture of swords, you were flint-headed spears. Or they talk about flint-headed arrows, but these things are useless against arrows. Because if you're the defenders, then in here, okay, you're protected from arrows, but once the people get standing up on that bank, firing arrows at you, you're goosed. So I haven't seen a credible explanation as to what level of weaponry was being effective in protecting and defending this establishment. There's lots of more unanswered questions and mysteries about these linear earthwork than there is any answer. And then O'Mea's Newry Road, where the canal goes into Carniford Lough. There's a map there, or was the last time I looked, dated 1742, when the canal was constructed, and it shows you a lake here, Loch Dian. Now the townland's called Loch Dian nowadays, but there was a lake there. That lake existed to the 1760s, but I think the canal company paid William Lucas, William Fivey. You passed Listenerbraig Lodge there. You saw the sign not about a half a mile back there.
And who originally lived in it?
The people, well, there's been a number, but Fiveys lived there at the time of the canal being built. That's the 1700s. William Fivey. I think the canal people paid him to drain the lake out into Loch Shark to feed the waters for the canal, somewhat waters for the canal.
And how did they do that, you know?
It had to be over in that direction. You know, before you come up that hill then, you went down into a wee hollow and said there was a road into your left. At that point, there was two things. I think that's drained out through there into it. But that also contained what you might call the equivalent of a mill race. Lebrickland Lake, waters of Lebrickland Lake were also used to feed the canal. The river that drains Lebrickland Lake runs down the valley further up this road going into Lebrickland. And it was dammed away over there on the far side of those sheds. It was dammed. And there was a culvert dug following all the contours away out around the countryside back to that hollow. And it fed in there and down into the Loch Shark. I remember that culvert being there. It ran through that field. You could see the way it ran around the hillside following the contours. And it wasn't used then, of course. Canal had closed up by that time and wasn't being used. So the owners, probably 30 years ago, just bulldozed the whole thing out. There's still a bridge on the road where the culvert ran underneath the bridge.
I can see that, you know, because I live on the Loch Dian Road.
There's the one on the Loch Dian, there's one on the Four Town School Road as well.
Yes.
You know where Heather McGaw, isn't it, or whatever, Craig's her surname is now, yes. Where she lives just above that, there's a corner on the road, you go over a bridge. That is where that culvert comes through. And further up between Meenan Road above Kew, between Meenan Road and Four Town School Road, there was a dam built to hold back that water and feed that culvert all the way into Loch Shark. So, yes, I think that's all I have to say. Danes Cast. Danes Cast started down on the far side of that bog. It ran just this side of those sheds, somewhere up that ploughed field, one side of it. This side of those sheds, down into the hollow again, another bog. Started again on the far side, and it's still to be found. Once it comes out of that bog, it runs up the side of a field right away to the next road. It's quite a good section as well, but looks a lot wetter than that one we walked in, but essentially the same sort of structure. And after that, it's nothing, but from then on it's nothing but the odd little fragment. This is all the best part of it. So this essentially is the tour. You really want to, we could stop one last stop and just look back out over the valley and Poyntzpass, a nice view, but essentially this is the end of the tour. So again, we can go down and end at the canal bank if you want to, but no, I'll just end it here. I'm heading for Petty Sessions with a cup of coffee.
Thank you, Roy. That's been very, very good. Very useful. Well done.
Thank you.
Take a bow.
And well done about the weather as well.